On the freezing night of June 7, 1998, in the quiet suburb of Barberton, Ohio, 58-year-old Judy Rausch was fast asleep in her home. Sleeping in the adjacent bedroom was her 6-year-old granddaughter, Brooke. The neighborhood was silent, nestled in a hard-working Midwestern community where families rarely locked their front doors. But as the clock struck 2 a.m., an unknown intruder slipped through a side window into the dark house. Within minutes, a peaceful night turned into a scene of unspeakable terror. Judy Rausch was brutally attacked and murdered in her bed. The intruder then entered the young child's room, committing a horrific assault on 6-year-old Brooke before leaving her for dead in the dark. Miraculously, little Brooke survived the ordeal. When morning came, neighbors discovered the bloody crime scene and immediately called emergency services. Sirens pierced the quiet morning air as police cruisers, ambulances, and forensic units flooded the street. The entire town of Barberton was paralyzed with horror and rage. The media descended upon the neighborhood, demanding swift answers. Police leadership felt tremendous pressure from both the public and local politicians to apprehend the monster responsible before fear ruined the town's sense of safety. First responders found 6-year-old Brooke severely traumatized, bruised, and in a state of profound medical shock. In the chaotic hours immediately following the assault, detectives attempted to question the child while she was still hospitalized and heavily medicated. Confused, terrified, and grasping for familiar names in her shattered memory, the child uttered a name when asked who had hurt her. She mentioned her uncle, Clarence Elkins. Clarence Elkins was a 35-year-old family man, a loving husband to Judy Rausch's daughter, Melinda, and a devoted father to 2 young sons. He had no history of violence, no criminal record, and enjoyed a warm relationship with his extended family. On the night of the murder, Clarence had been over 50 miles away in the city of Canton, Ohio, spending the evening drinking beer, playing cards, and watching television with friends and family members. An alibi confirmed by multiple witnesses. Yet, to detectives under intense media scrutiny, the traumatized child's mention of his name was all the justification they needed to target Clarence as their prime suspect. On the afternoon of June 8, 1998, police officers arrived at Clarence Elkins' home. Clarence, shocked and heartbroken by the news of his mother-in-law's murder and the attack on his niece, voluntarily accompanied detectives to the police station. He assumed he was going to help them find the killer. He freely gave fingerprints, provided hair samples, allowed officers to search his home, and cooperated fully with every request. He knew he had spent the entire night 50 miles away surrounded by witnesses. He trusted that scientific facts and his solid alibi would immediately clear his name. However, investigators developed acute tunnel vision. They ignored the fact that 5 independent witnesses swore under oath that Clarence was in Canton at the time of the crime. They ignored the fact that no blood, foreign fibers, or physical evidence linking Clarence to the crime scene were found on his clothes, in his car, or at his home. When state forensic labs analyzed blood and biological material recovered from the victim's body, the results clearly showed that the DNA did not match Clarence Elkins. The physical evidence pointed toward an unknown male offender. Instead of expanding their search for the real killer, the prosecution sought out subjective junk science to bolster their weak case. They brought in a forensic odontologist, a bite mark analyst, who claimed that a mark on the victim's body matched Clarence Elkins' dental structure. At the time, bite mark evidence was touted in courtrooms as an exact science, despite having no rigorous scientific validity. Combined with the child's traumatized identification testimony, prosecutors built a narrative that convinced themselves, and eventually a grand jury, that Clarence was guilty. In 1999, Clarence Elkins stood trial for aggravated murder, attempted murder, and felonious assault in the Summit County Court of Common Pleas. The trial was an emotional firestorm. The prosecution painted Clarence as a monster who hid behind a quiet suburban facade. Clarence's defense attorney, underpaid and unprepared, failed to effectively cross-examine the bite mark expert or call independent forensic scientists to highlight the complete absence of DNA evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Clarence Elkins was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 55 years. As he was led away in iron shackles, Clarence looked at his crying wife, Melinda, and promised her that he would never stop fighting for his freedom. Clarence Elkins was transported to the Mansfield Correctional Institution, a maximum security prison in Ohio notorious for gang violence, overcrowding, and harsh living conditions. The heavy steel doors slammed shut behind him, cutting him off from the world he knew. He was placed in a tiny concrete cell surrounded by razor wire, high concrete walls, and armed guard towers. For a man who had spent his life working hard, taking care of his family, and abiding by the law, being thrust into a maximum security prison was a horrifying experience. In maximum security, wrongfully convicted individuals face a devastating psychological battle. Many surrender to hopelessness, falling into severe depression or becoming hardened by the violence around them. Clarence chose a different path. Remembering the promise he made to his wife, he decided that he would keep his mind sharp, maintain a flawless disciplinary record, and use every free hour in the prison law library to study legal procedure and post-conviction appeals. Meanwhile, on the outside, his wife, Melinda Elkins, launched an extraordinary crusade for justice. Melinda refused to believe that her husband was a killer. She knew him deeply, and she knew the state had made a catastrophic error. Melinda gave up her career, spent her family savings, and turned herself into a full-time investigator. She walked the streets of Barberton, knocked on doors late at night, interviewed local residents, and examined police logs from the night of the murder. Melinda also reached out to the Ohio Innocence Project, a newly established legal clinic at the University of Cincinnati College of Law led by attorney Mark Godsey. Moved by Melinda's extraordinary dedication, and alarmed by the complete lack of physical evidence connecting Clarence to the crime, the legal team agreed to take on the case pro bono. Together, Clarence on the inside, Melinda on the outside, and the Innocence Project team formed an unyielding alliance dedicated to exposing the truth. As Melinda Elkins continued her independent investigation into the criminal history of the Barberton area, she uncovered a chilling detail that local police had completely overlooked in 1998. On the night Judy Roush was murdered, a career criminal named Earl Mann was living in the exact same neighborhood, just a short distance from the crime scene. Earl Mann was a violent repeat offender with a long rap sheet that included home invasions, brutal physical assaults, and sexual offenses against women. Even more astonishing was the fact that shortly after the 1998 murder, Earl Mann had been arrested for a violent assault on another woman in the same area. Yet, because Barberton police focused exclusively on Clarence Elkins, Earl Mann was never questioned, his whereabouts were never checked, and his DNA was never compared to the biological evidence found at the crime scene. Armed with this critical new lead, Melinda passed the information to the Ohio Innocence Project. However, legal hurdles stood firmly in their way. State prosecutors argued that the defense had no legal standing to force Earl Mann to provide a DNA sample, as he was not a named suspect in the original trial. The judicial system demanded concrete proof before it would grant an order for new DNA testing, creating a seemingly impossible legal paradox. In 2002, Clarence Elkins was unexpectedly transferred from Mansfield Correctional Institution to another facility, the Belmont Correctional Institution in St. Clairsville, Ohio. At first, Clarence viewed the transfer as just another painful disruption in his endless prison routine. He had no idea that an unbelievable twist of fate was waiting for him inside the walls of his new home. A coincidence so extraordinary that no screenwriter could have invented it. Shortly after arriving at Belmont Correctional Institution, Clarence was assigned to a cell block housing inmates serving time for various felony offenses. As he walked through the common area one afternoon, he noticed a new inmate who had recently been transferred into the same housing unit. Clarence listened quietly as other prisoners called the man by his name, Earl Mann. Clarence stood frozen in shock. The man whose name his wife had uncovered, the violent predator who lived near the crime scene in 1998, was standing just yards away from him, sharing the same prison unit. Earl Mann had been sent to Belmont to serve a sentence for an unrelated violent offense. Clarence's heart pounded in his chest. He realized he was standing face to face with the man who held the key to his freedom, or the man who had destroyed his family. Rather than confronting Mann with anger or accusation, which would have put his own life in grave danger and caused Mann to hide, Clarence chose to act with extraordinary restraint. He decided to play the role of an undercover investigator from inside his own prison cell. Over the next several weeks, Clarence carefully observed Earl Mann's daily routines. He watched where Mann sat during meals, who he talked to, and what items he used. Clarence noticed that Mann was an avid smoker who frequently discarded cigarette butts in the prison yard. He realized that if he could somehow retrieve one of those discarded cigarette butts without drawing attention, he would have a fresh, direct sample of Earl Mann's DNA. The operation was fraught with immense risk. If prison guards caught an inmate picking up another prisoner's property, or if Earl Mann realized Clarence was collecting his personal items, the consequences could be violent. But Clarence knew this was his only chance to break the legal deadlock that kept him trapped behind bars. On a cold morning in the prison yard, Clarence watched closely as Earl Mann leaned against a concrete wall, finished smoking a cigarette, dropped the butt onto the pavement, and stubbed it out with his boot before walking away. Clarence waited for the yard to clear slightly. Moving calmly and casually, he walked over to the spot, bent down as if tying his shoe, picked up the discarded cigarette, but wrapped it carefully in a clean piece of toilet paper he had prepared, and slipped it into his pocket. He then returned straight to his cell, placed the wrapped sample into a clean plastic bag, and sealed it. Using the prison mail system, Clarence safely sent the sealed package directly to his attorney, Mark Godsey, at the Ohio Innocence Project, along with a handwritten letter detailing how he had personally obtained the sample from Earl Mann inside Belmont Correctional Institution. The legal team immediately submitted the cigarette, but to an accredited, independent forensic laboratory for high-sensitivity DNA extraction. Scientists extracted a clean male genomic profile from the saliva on the filter and compared it directly to the unidentified crime scene DNA collected from the 1998 murder scene. The laboratory results were absolute, definitive, and indisputable. The DNA extracted from Earl Mann's cigarette, but matched the unknown killer's DNA from the crime scene in every single genetic marker. The statistical probability of the DNA belonging to anyone else was 1 in several billion. The truth was finally exposed. Clarence Elkins was 100% innocent, and the real killer had been sitting in the cell block right next to him all along. Faced with this incontrovertible scientific proof, the Ohio Innocence Project filed an emergency petition for a new trial and immediate release. When presented with the lab results, even state prosecutors could no longer defend the conviction. On December 15, 2005, a judge formally vacated all charges against Clarence Elkins, ordering his immediate and permanent release from custody. On December 15, 2005, after nearly 8 years, almost 3,000 days, of wrongful imprisonment, the heavy iron doors of the courthouse opened into the crisp winter air. Clarence Elkins walked out as a completely free man. A crowd of reporters, camera crews, family members, and legal supporters cheered on the courthouse steps. Clarence walked straight into the arms of his devoted wife, Melinda, whose unyielding love and relentless investigation had kept the fight alive. They embraced tightly, weeping tears of pure joy and relief. A moment that proved that truth, patience, and love could overcome even the most stubborn legal injustice. Following Clarence's release, Earl Mann was formally indicted, tried, and convicted for the 1998 murder of Judy Roush and the assault on Little Brook. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that the true perpetrator was held accountable. Clarence Elkins was awarded financial compensation by the state of Ohio for his wrongful imprisonment. More importantly, his case served as a major catalyst for sweeping judicial reforms across the state of Ohio. As a direct result of Clarence's case, the state enacted new laws regarding the preservation of biological evidence, reformed eyewitness identification procedures, and strictly curtailed the use of unproven bite mark evidence in criminal trials. Clarence turned his painful experience into a crusade for others. He became a prominent advocate for the Innocence Project, traveling the country to speak out against junk science and to support other wrongfully convicted individuals fighting for their freedom. The story of Clarence Elkins remains one of the most astonishing cautionary tales in legal history, a powerful reminder of the dangers of police tunnel vision, a warning against unscientific forensics, and an unforgettable testament to an innocent man who took his fate into his own hands behind prison bars to bring the truth to light.